The cows lowed drowsily in the meadows beyond St. Mary Mead, and the morning milk came, as it always did, in the cool blue hour before 8. It was one of those minor certainties of village life. The clink of bottles on the back steps, the muffled creak of the milk cart's wheels, the faint whistle of young Billy, Cottrell as he made his rounds. Houses changed hands, vicars came and went, the war had come and gone, but the milk had always arrived. On this particular June morning, Mrs. Martha Price opened her back door precisely at 8 o'clock and peered out, her apron neatly tied and her lips already pursed for disapproval. She did not know at whom she disapproved, but experience had taught her that someone would very soon present themselves as worthy of it. The air smelt of dew, coal smoke and early roses from Miss Hartnell's overzealous garden. The milk was there, 2 bottles standing on the step. Mrs. Price bent down, lifted one, and paused. The glass felt oddly sticky beneath her fingers. Frowning, she held the bottle up to the light. On the creamy surface floated a strange iridescent sheen, faint but unmistakable, like oil on a puddle. Mrs. Price was not by nature fanciful. She set the bottle down at once. "George," she called sharply into the gloomy kitchen, "come here a moment." Mr. George Price appeared, solid and slow, with the air of a man who had expected no peace from the minute he awoke. "What is it now, Martha?" "There's something wrong with the milk," said Mrs. Price, in the tightly controlled tone that implied grave moral fault. George glanced with masculine indifference. "Looks all right to me." "It does not. Look closer." He peered, then grunted. "Bit queer, that. Maybe the bottles wasn't rinsed proper at the dairy." Mrs. Price sniffed. "Dairies do not send out milk in a filthy condition, not the respectable area. And Billy Cottrell is not the sort of boy to meddle with bottles, though his socks are never properly darned. No, George, there is something very peculiar here." Across the lane, in a pretty, somewhat over-adorned cottage, Mrs. Diana Hewitt made almost exactly the same discovery. She, however, gave a little exclamation of distaste, pushed the bottle away, and being of a quick and modern disposition, rang at once for her maid. "Gladys, look at this. The milk's bad. I shall complain to the dairy. It's absolutely disgusting." At the same moment, in a small house with an immaculate garden and an elderly primness about its curtains, Miss Jane Marple opened her own back door. She wore an old but well-brushed cardigan and a small violet spray, already slightly drooping at her collar. The bottles stood where they always stood. Miss Marple lifted one, held it to the light for a moment longer, than was perhaps strictly necessary, and then smiled very faintly and quite to herself. She did not call anyone. Instead, she brought the milk inside, placed it on the scrub table, and went in search of her little notebook, the one with the stiff black cover in which she occasionally wrote down curious happenings. Not crimes, oh dear, no. That would have been melodramatic, just odd things. Human beings, Miss Marple often reflected, revealed themselves most clearly not in grand moments, but in the small, apparently trivial divergences from their habits. Outside, Billy Cottrell pushed his cart along the lane, frowning. He had slept badly. The load felt heavier this morning, or perhaps it was only his conscience. He thought fleetingly of a certain conversation overheard the previous evening behind the Blue Boar, and of a hand, white, ringed, impatient, pressing a small bottle into us. By 11 o'clock, 3 respectable households in St. Mary Mead had discovered that something was wrong with the morning milk. By noon, one of those households would be hosting a corpse. Miss Marple did not, as some of her more energetic neighbours might have done, rush out into the lane. She moved instead with unhurried deliberation, putting aside her knitting, straightening a slight crook in the antimacassar, and reaching for her worn but serviceable cardigan. Only then did she step quietly into her front garden, where a small knot of villagers had already begun to form, each one brimming with conjecture. "It'll be his heart," declared Mrs. Price the elder, arms folded firmly over her ample bosom. "He was always shouting that one, red in the face like a beetroot. Mark my words, the Lord doesn't intend folk to work themselves up so." "Heart?" sniffed Mrs. Bantry, who had come trotting briskly down the lane despite promising her husband she would not get involved. "Did you not hear what Albertson said? Blood. A bad fall, I dare say. Men never look where they're going." "Falls don't make a man's head like that," put in Miss Adair Badger, the village butcher, arriving with his basket and a professional authority on such matters. "I've seen enough injuries to know the difference between an accident and, well, something else." Miss Marple slipped into the edge of the group, murmuring a soft "Good morning," that was acknowledged only absently. The entire village was tilting towards the drama like flowers to sunlight. The vicar, having regained some of his composure, was wheeling out his old bicycle. "I must not go to the dairy at once," he said, mostly to himself, but with the satisfying feeling of a man taking charge. "There may be messages to send, the police to notify." "Inspector Slack'll be called, you'll see," interjected Mrs. Bantry, half with relish, half with dread. He never did take kindly to outside opinions, especially not of the feminine sort. Miss Marple's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. "The inspector is a very capable man," she said mildly, "though I dare say he has much to occupy him." "Capable, perhaps," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice a fraction, "but he never does seem to understand that people don't always say what they mean, or mean what they say. You've seen more of that than any of them." "This was Jane." "It is surprising," Miss Marple observed, "how very alike human beings can be, even in the most different surroundings. I remember a charwoman in Paddington who was quite as artful as any duchess I have ever read about, and no doubt if poor Mr. Pemberton has come to grief, there will be some very human reason for it." Her eyes drifted, apparently idly, to the milk bottles on Mrs. Price's doorstep. The liquid inside was faintly discoloured, a chalky hue that was not quite right. Mrs. Price noticed her glance and held up the bottle. "Disgraceful, that's what it is," she announced. "Look at it. Thin as water and some queer scum at the top. I took one sip and spat it right out. I said to Alf, I said, 'You'll not be having that in your tea, my lad. Not if you value your innards. All the milk's wrong, Mrs. Price?' Miss Marple inquired with innocent curiosity. "Not only yours." "All along the lane, Miss Marple," said young Elsie Holland, who worked mornings at the grocer's. "I've had 3 complaints already. Mrs. Bartlett said it tasted bitter. Funny, isn't it, the very morning he's found dead?" "Very funny indeed," murmured Miss Marple, her expression one of gentle bewilderment, though one mustn't jump to conclusions. Milk, after all, is so very liable, capable to contamination if not handled properly. The vicar mounted his bicycle somewhat awkwardly. "I shall go on then," he declared. Miss Marple, ladies, Mr. Mr. Badker, pray make them calm. There is doubtless some simple explanation." As he pedalled off toward the dairy, the villagers erupted into overlapping chatter. Theories, speculations, half-remembered grievances about short deliveries or watered cream. Miss Marple listened, saying very little, storing away scraps of information the way other women stored lace or ribbon. Bitter milk, blood among the crates. A man not much liked, yet much depended upon. It was, she reflected, rarely wise to meddle with people's morning habits. It disturbed more than the digestion. She turned back toward her cottage at last, moving with the slightly bird-like neatness that concealed so much sharp observation. There were telephone calls to be made, no doubt. Colonel Melchett would hear soon enough, and when Inspector Slack arrived he would find, as always, that St. Mary Mead had seen and heard a great deal, most of it, in his opinion, highly irrelevant. But Miss Marple had long ago discovered that what people thought irrelevant was often precisely where the truth began. Miss Marple, seeing that the tide of villagers was already beginning to drift in the direction of the dairy, decided that it would be both uncharitable and imprudent to remain entirely away. A sudden death touched everyone in a village, and a woman of her age could hardly be blamed for wishing to pay her respects. Or so she told herself with the faintest glimmer of amusement. She took the back path, a narrow hedged lane that led behind the vicarage, and emerged near the dairy yard. It was quieter there, the commotion from the front muffled by distance and brick. A constable from Much Benham, young, nervous, and obviously impressed with the gravity of his role, stood awkwardly by the open gate, his notebook clutched like a shield. "I'm afraid you can't go in, ma'am," he said at once, seeing her approach. "Police business. Inspector's orders." "But of course," Miss Marple replied, her voice as mild as warm milk. "I wouldn't dream of interfering. I merely came to see if there is anything I might do for poor Mrs. Mapperton. A cup of tea, perhaps, when she's ready for such a thing." The constable's expression softened. "That's very kind of you, miss. She's inside with Doctor Haydock just now. Nasty business. Head wound, the doctor said." "Ah, should," Miss Marple murmured. "A fall, perhaps." The constable hesitated. "Well, the inspector doesn't think so. There's a crate overturned, bottles smashed, milk everywhere. But the doctor says the blow's more deliberate, like. Miss Marple nodded, as if this were only what one might expect when a man was found dead among spilled milk and broken glass. Through the open doorway she could glimpse the cool, whitewashed interior of the dairy, shadows moving within. Another figure appeared, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a bristling moustache and an air of impatient efficiency. Inspector Craddock had been to St. Mary Mead before, and if he was not entirely delighted to see Miss Marple near the scene of a suspicious death, he was at least resigned to the inevitability of it. "Miss Marple," he said, with the wishy politeness reserved for formidable old ladies, "I might have known you wouldn't be content with knitting this morning." "I assure you, Inspector," she replied gently, "my knitting is very rarely content. It tangles itself in the most tiresome ways. I only came because one hears that poor Mr. Pemberton is no longer with us." "He is not," Craddock said shortly, "and I would be grateful if the village rumour mill did not add embroidery to the facts. There's been an accident, or something resembling one. Until we know more, that is all that needs to be said." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Still, it has already been said that there is blood among the milk and young Billy Cottrell nowhere to be found, and that all the bottles along the lane are quite undrinkable." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Undrinkable?" "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple said. "A distinctly unpleasant taste by all accounts. Bitter, medicinal. I confess it reminded me of poor Mr. Harbottle, who once attempted to dose his wife's gin with tonic medicine. The result was very much remarked upon at the time." The inspector grunted. "I'll have samples taken. Thank you, Miss Marple. In the meantime, I must ask you to leave this area clear, and if you hear anything at all about Billy Cottrell, you will inform me immediately." "But naturally," said Miss Marple, her tone one of placid agreement, while her mind moved quietly along altogether different lines. A quarrel heard the previous evening. "Tainted milk in every household, a missing delivery boy." And at the centre of it all, Arthur Pemberton. Domineering, feared, and it seemed us no longer merely disliked, but quite thoroughly dead. As she turned to retrace her steps along the hedged path, she reflected that in villages as in life, spilled milk was very rarely just spilled milk. The village itself settled into the peculiar stillness that follows a great disturbance, the sort of quiet in which whispers carry farther than shouts. By late afternoon, every parlour, shop counter and garden fence in St. Stephen's Mary Mead had become a tribunal, with Arthur Pemberton's character, habits and private affairs laid out and examined with ruthless thoroughness. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement poured tea with rather more vigour than was strictly necessary. The vicar, long accustomed to both her irreverence and Miss Marple's quiet penetration, sat opposite their guest with a troubled frown. "It really is most distressing, because of course," he said, stirring at his tea without appearing to notice what he was doing. "Arthur Pemberton murdered in St. Mary Mead of all places." One expects such things in London, but not at the dairy among the milk cans. "It is the among that makes it so very interesting," Miss Marple observed mildly, adding a modest amount of sugar. "I always think that when something violent intrudes on the most ordinary domestic arrangements, one is more likely to find personal motives than impersonal ones. Milk deliveries are such intimate things, when you come to think of it." Griselda gave a small snort. "Trust you to make even milk sound suspicious, Jane." From what I've heard at the hairdressers, half the county had a reason to loathe Arthur Pemberton. He cheated the farmers, watered the milk, shouted at his staff, and pinched every possible penny. "Not that I condone murder, of course," she added hastily, "but if you make enough enemies, it hardly seems surprising when someone eventually takes action." "Quite," Miss Marple murmured, "though taking action requires means as well as motive. I wonder, for instance, who had access to the milk processing machines, and who knew the timing of the early deliveries?" The vicar looked startled. "The milk? You think the tainted deliveries are connected to the murder?" "It would be a remarkable coincidence if they were not," Miss Marple said gently. "I have often found that when two unusual things occur together, there is usually a thread between them, like those dreadful variegated yarns they tell in on colour Her thoughts drifted briefly to the crinkled foil cap and the faintly medicinal bitterness of the milk. Not poison, she thought, no, something more pedestrian, but deliberate all the same. Something to spoil, to alarm, perhaps to send a message. Meanwhile, at the village shop, Miss Hartwell leaned confidentially across the counter to where Mrs. Price and Elsie Holland stood in a conspiratorial cluster. "I saw Julian Pemberton in here only last week," the postmistress said with relish, "buying one of those foreign cigarettes and a bottle of aspirin. Looked pale as a ghost he did, and jumpy. Asked whether his uncle's life insurance premiums had come through the post yet. Hardly the concern of a man on affectionate terms with his uncle, if you ask me." "Life insurance!" Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "Mark my words, there's something in that. Nephews can be as greedy as anyone." Elsie, torn between fear and the thrill of scandal, said in a hushed tone, "And my cousin Tom, he helps out at the dairy sometimes," said Mr. Pemberton had words with Mrs. Pemberton just yesterday, proper shouting match, about some letter. Tom heard her say, "If this comes out, we'll both be ruined." "Ruined," Miss Hartwell repeated thoughtfully. "Letters, insurance, poisoned milk deliveries, and a vanished boy. There's more to this than Billy Cottrell pinching a few shillings, you mark my words." In her neat sitting room, Miss Marple was reaching much the same conclusion, though by a very different route. She mentally arranged the day's observations as she might arrange flowers, testing one grouping, then another, seeing which elements belonged together and which did not. Billy's disappearance was untidy, she thought, and untidiness was often either genuine panic or deliberate staging. Pemberton's composure was quite the opposite. Too tidy, too self-controlled, almost as if she were performing the part of the dignified widow for an unseen audience. And Julian's eyes, that persistent flick toward the stacked milk crates and the office door, as though expecting something or dreading it. The milk itself, of course, was the key. It so often was in a village, the small deadly thing that everyone took for granted until it went wrong. Human beings, Miss Marple reflected silently, are very much like milk, perfectly harmless in their proper containers, but if left to stand, they can sour in the most unexpected ways. She rose, reached for her hat and gloves, and decided that a little walk past the dairy, at twilight when people were tired and less watchful of their expressions, might be extremely instructive, but Inspector Slack did not care to have his theories disturbed once they had settled comfortably in his mind. Nevertheless, Miss Marple's simple arithmetic could not be ignored. He cleared his throat, tugging at his collar, as though it had suddenly grown too tight. "Very well," he said brusquely. "The boy may not have done the delivery, but that does not clear him of murder or theft. It merely means he had help, or that someone took advantage of the situation." "Poor dear." His gaze swept the group, landing for a moment on Julian Pemberton, then sliding away, as though reluctant to linger on a man of better social standing. "We'll continue this inside," Slack announced. "Pock, take the boy down to the station and get a proper statement. Mrs. Pemberton, if you would be so good as to show me Mr. Pemberton's office and those letters you mentioned." The crowd began to disperse, though not far. Mary Mead possessed an admirable capacity for remaining close enough to overhear without technically intruding. Miss Marple, with a murmured word to the vicar about returning a borrowed gardening book later, drifted toward the dairy with the air of a harmless old lady who had taken a wrong, turning, and might very well be escorted home at any moment. No one did. Sure, he did escort her home. In the small yard behind the dairy, she paused, ostensibly to admire the late flowering Michaelmas daisies that had sprung up by the wall. From there she had an excellent view through the Hailclern loading book. The interior was in some disarray. Several milk crates lay overturned, their contents forming white rivulets that had dried in sticky streaks along the concrete. Two large metal churns stood to one side, lids askew. A shattered glass measuring cylinder lay swept into an untidy pile, as though someone had attempted to tidy up but abandoned the task halfway. Julian Pemberton hovered at the doorway, smoking with a nervous intensity that belied his languid posture. He watched as his aunt led Inspector Slack toward the small office off the main floor. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn not to the people but to the things. There was something not quite right about the churns. They were of different makes, one old and dented, the other newer, with a polished lid. The older churn bore a faint ring around its middle, a line where milk had clearly sat for some time. The newer churn had a similar ring, but higher up, as though it had been recently filled to a different level. On the concrete beneath them was a small irregular patch that had been hastily wiped, but not properly cleaned. A faint acrid scent hung about that area, distinct from the usual sour milk smell of dairies. Fascinating, isn't it, how habit tell on people? Miss Marple murmured to herself, bending very slightly as though to adjust her shoe. In doing so, she noted a tiny crumpled square of silver foil trapped in a crack in the floor. It was not from a factory-sealed cap. Someone had peeled this one back and then tried clumsily to smooth it down again. Inside the office, raised voices floated out. Mrs. Pemberton's cool tones and Inspector Slack's more irritable ones. Here are the letters, Inspector, all unsigned, all in the same crude block capitals. You should have brought these straight to the police, madam. An invited public senator, my husband believed in handling his own affairs. Julian flicked ash onto the ground, his jaw tightening. Those letters could have come from any of the suppliers, he said sharply. Uncle drove a hard bargain. Farmers don't like being kept to contracts when prices rise. Or, came a new voice from the doorway, unexpectedly crisp. They might have come from someone much closer to home. All turned to see Miss Hartwell, the postmistress, standing with her handbag clutched tightly. Her usually placid face was flushed with something like indignation, and Miss Marple observed, perhaps a trace of fear. I shouldn't like to speak out of turn, Miss Hartwell went on, but if you're looking for someone with a real grudge against Mr. Pemberton, you might do well to consider Miss Lydia Drake. Who? Slack demanded. My assistant at the post office, Miss Hartwell said. She used to work here at the dairy, until Mr. Pemberton dismissed her, quite harshly over some discrepancy in the account. She said once, in temper, that she wished he'd choke on his own milk. Miss Marple, turning away as though the conversation pained her, allowed herself the smallest of thoughtful nods. Miss Lydia Drake, a new name, and in her experience new names were rarely introduced in village dramas without some significance. And still, beneath everything, there remained that bitter medicinal smell in the milk, and that faint acrid patch beneath the churns. Small details that, like the loose threads on her knitting, could not be ignored, if one wished the pattern to emerge correctly. Inspector Slack turned his attention to Mrs. Hodge with renewed vigour, sensing in her arrival both complication and opportunity. She was a solid middle-aged woman with capable hands and an air of quiet indignation at finding her tidy accounts department transformed into the centre of scandal. You say anyone who worked here would know about this stuff, Slack said, holding up the brown bottle. That includes you, I suppose, and the boy, and Mr. Julian Pemberton, when he deigned to lend a hand. Mrs. Hodge's lips tightened. I knew of it, yes. Mr. Pemberton kept it in the locked cupboard in his office. Only he and I had keys. Billy wouldn't have had access unless one of us left the cupboard unlocked, which we did not. Keys, repeated Miss Marple softly, as though the word held some private significance. Such curious things, keys. They so often seem to find their way into the wrong hands. Julian stepped closer, bristling and gurgling. Are we seriously entertaining the idea that I poisoned the village milk with my uncle's laxative? For what purpose, may I ask? To risk killing off half my inheritance base? Mrs. Pemberton regarded her nephew narrowly. No one is suggesting such melodrama, Julian. Though I do wonder, she added it with dour composure, just when you came by the dairy last night. You have a habit of dropping in unannounced when you need money. He met her gaze with something close to hatred. I told you! I was in London. All night, she pressed. All night of the comfortable gate, he repeated, though even Inspector Slack noticed the fractional hesitation before the words. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had drifted toward the office door. She peered inside with apparent absent-mindedness. The room was small and scrupulously neat. Ledger books, aligned in precise rows, an ink bottle without a single splash on the blotter, a calendar showing the previous day circled, in red pencil. Her eyes came to rest upon the key cupboard beside the desk, its small wooden door hanging just slightly ajar. How very odd she met. More to herself than to anyone in particular. I do hope Mr. Pemberton wasn't becoming forgetful in his later years. An open key cupboard can be such a temptation. Mrs. Hodge gave a small gasp. That was shut when I left yesterday afternoon. I'm certain of it. Locked, too. I checked as I always do. And you were here until what time? Miss Marple asked brightly, as though inquiring about the weather. 3:30. I always take the 4 o'clock bus back to Much Benham. Miss Marple's knitting bag mind, as she herself sometimes called it, was busily sorting threads. Mrs. Hodge gone by 3:30, Billy discovering the body at 4 by his account. An argument heard around 7 by Miss Hartwell. Morning milk delivered at 8, contaminated but competently processed. Somewhere between those times lay the true story, and it did not, in her experience, look particularly favourable for any of those present. It might be helpful, she suggested gently to Bowden, to the inspector, if we were to establish everyone's movements yesterday afternoon and evening. After all, human beings are rather like trains. They cannot be in 2 places at once, and a timetable is most revealing when properly consulted. Slack, who generally disliked metaphors, found himself grudgingly agreeing. Right then, he said briskly. We'll start with you, Mrs. Pemberton, and then Mr. Julian, Mrs. Hodge, you'll stay available for further questions. The boy goes nowhere. As he began taking statements in his blunt, methodical manner, Miss Marple quietly slipped away, leaving behind the chill of the dairy for the familiar warmth of the village lane. She had learned long ago that people often spoke more freely when they believed the important questions had already been asked. There was, she reflected, one person whose recollections of yesterday's events were likely to be both detailed and unfiltered. Miss Hartwell at the post office, whose talent for noticing other people's business rivaled even her own. And besides, there was still the matter of the threatening letters, those curious missives that had warned Arthur Pemberton he had watered down his last delivery. The question of keys, once raised, spread through St. Mary Mead with the rapidity of spilled ink. By late afternoon, the village buzzed not only with talk of poisoned milk and murder, but with a new and subtler anxiety. Who exactly had access to what? Inspector Slack, having taken formal statements at the dairy, now held court in the vicarage drawing-room, which had been reluctantly transformed into a temporary incident room. Mrs. Clement supplied tea and scones with her usual efficiency, though her eyes betrayed the strain of having to crime so uncomfortably close to the parish. Miss Marple, of course, had been invited to rest after all the excitement, and it was merely incidental that the armchair chosen for her offered an excellent vantage point from which to observe everyone. Let us be systematic, the vicar suggested in his irreproachable manner. Mr. Pemberton, Mrs. Hodge, young Billy, as we've already established, had regular access. But keys do have a curious way of multiplying, as Miss Marple has rightly observed. Julian Pemberton admitted to helping with busy periods, Mrs. Clement added, carefully passing a plate of scones past the inspector's spread files. He must have had use of keys at those times. Julian, lounging more than sitting on the vicarage settee, gave a weary shrug. Uncle Arthur kept everything under his own thumb. If I needed to get in, I fetched him. Yes, I knew where he hid the spare office key in the ledger cupboard, but I never went rummaging for it unless he told me to. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a quiet, reassuring sound that seemed to steady the atmosphere. She looked up mildly. One can't help noticing that in villages spare keys so often migrate. Why, I remember when Mrs. Finch's back-door key found its way to her gardener's pocket, simply because he was forever needing to get at her tool shed. Inspector Slack, who had little patience for parables, grunted. What about you, Mrs. Hodge? Ever given a key to anyone else? Husband, children? A neighbour? Mrs. Hodge flushed. I took a duplicate of his key home once, Inspector, when Mr. Pemberton was poorly and I had to come in early, but I never let it out of my bag. And my Sid couldn't care less about dairies. He says milk turns his stomach. Yet someone opened that medicine cabinet after you left yesterday, the inspector persisted. And someone had finished the bottling and delivered this morning's milk while the boy was already on the run. The vicar, who had been turning the matter over in his mind, spoke gently. Might they be 2 different someones, Inspector? One person interested in Mr. Pemberton's private medicines, another in his milk supply and business papers? Miss Marple glanced at him with quiet approval. Human motives are rarely tidy, I've often found, she remarked, though it's very interesting that the cascara was used, not arsenic or something truly lethal. It suggests, if one may say so, a certain knowledge of consequences and limits. Julian shifted uncomfortably. What are you implying? That whoever tampered with the milk wanted to frighten the whole village without actually killing anyone? Or, Miss Marple replied gently, that they wished to create a scandal quite separate from the matter of murder? Something noisy and public to distract from something quiet, private, like missing documents, for instance. It was Mrs. Clement who unwittingly added the next crucial piece. I met Mrs. Pemberton at the grocer's only last week, she said thoughtfully. She seemed very distressed, spoke of everything slipping away, and Arthur refusing to listen. I assumed it was their usual domestic difficulties, but now I wonder. Mrs. Pemberton will be questioned again, Slack said decisively, though his tone held less certainty than before. And as for this missing evidence Pemberton claimed to have, someone in this village knows where it is, or destroyed it. Mrs. Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment, as then resumed. Destroyed, perhaps, she said sorrowfully. But if Mr. Pemberton was as methodical as he appears from his desk, I should be very much surprised if he had only one copy. Inspector Slack lumbered across the yard toward the stack of crates, barking at Constable Polk to give him a hand. Together they shifted to the top layer aside, wooden slats scraping against one another with a protesting squeal. Beneath them, half buried in straw and damp earth, lay a small metal strongbox, its surface streaked with mud, but its lock unmistakably new and sturdy. "Now what have we here?" Slack murmured, suddenly far more interested. He stooped and heaved the box out, setting it on an upturned crate. The lock had been forced crudely, leaving the clasp twisted and useless. Someone was in rather a hurry about it, Miss Marple observed mildly, her eyes lingering on the jagged metal. Not the work of a careful man, I think. More the sort of job one sees when boys break into summer houses for a lark. The strongbox yielded little at first glance. A few folded documents, an empty cloth bag, and a broken pencil. Inspector Slack spread the papers out with meaty fingers, his brow furrowing as he read. "Delivery ledger," he announced. "Detailed ones, too, separate from the main books. Looks like Pemberton was keeping a private record. Quantities, fat content, farms of origin." He paused, tapping a particular page. "And look here, notations in red ink. Suspected dilution, Julian present. Unexplained shortfall, Billy en route." Julian's face drained of colour. "Uncle Arthur had no right to keep a secret ledger. That's practically entrapment." Mrs. Hodge, who had hovered anxiously in the doorway, let out a small gasp. "So that's where it went. I saw Mr. Pemberton with that box 3 days ago. He said he'd have finally caught the scoundrel by the tail." "But the most interesting thing," Miss Marple said softly, "is what is no longer there. That empty cloth bag suggests something of importance was removed. Money, perhaps, or those documentary proofs he mentioned in his letter to the ministry." Inspector Slack grunted, though not disagreeably. "So the murderer kills Pemberton, steals his evidence, breaks open the strongbox, and makes off in the dairy van. Clean as you please." His gaze flicked toward Julian with unmistakable suspicion. "You'd know where Uncle kept his valuables, wouldn't you, sir?" Julian lifted his chin with brittle defiance. "I know nothing about that box. If I wanted to stop my uncle's accusations, why would I risk driving the dairy van through every village lane at dawn, drawing attention to myself?" "Because," came a new voice from the yard gate, "there are some things one can't simply leave behind." All heads turned. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, stood framed in the gateway, his medical bag in hand, and his usually sardonic expression more sober than usual. He stepped forward, nodding to Miss Marple with a brief acknowledgement before addressing the inspector. "I've just come from examining Pemberton," he said without preamble. "Cause of death is entirely consistent with a heavy blow to the back of the head. No signs of defensive wounds. I'd say he knew his attacker, turned his back on them without suspicion." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her mind, fitting this new piece into the pattern forming there. Someone close enough to be trusted. Someone with access to records and keys and sufficient knowledge to run the bottling equipment and complete the delivery route without arousing alarm. "But there is one more thing," Haydock added, his eyes sharpening. "Judging from lividity and rigour, I'd place the time of death between 5 and 7 yesterday evening, not 4 in the afternoon, as young Billy claimed." The resulting stir of whispers and exclamations washed over Miss Marple like a familiar tide. A new discrepancy, a fresh crack in someone's story. Billy's panicked timeline, the van's disappearance, the tainted milk, all now demanded to be rearranged. She folded her hands neatly before her. "How very peculiar," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "It would seem that our morning milk may not be the only thing in St. Mary Mead that has been tampered with." The corrected time of death unsettled Inspector Slack more than he cared to admit. It wrenched his neat little sequence of events into an awkward, ill-fitting shape, and he did not like puzzles that refused to conform. "If Pemberton died between 6 and 7, he said grudgingly, then the boy here couldn't have found him at 4, which means he's lying. Billy's already pale face blanched further. "I swear, sir, it was afternoon. The sun was still up proper. I remember the shadows across the yard, long like." "Maybe I got the hour wrong, but memory can be a most unreliable thing under shock," Miss Marple observed mildly, watching the youth with a kindly, appraising gaze. "I recall a young maid once who insisted her mistress had fallen at 11, when in fact it was nearly 2. Shock does the most extraordinary things to one's sense of time." Her tone was gentle, but her mind was anything but. She noted how Billy's confusion seemed genuine, his distress unfeigned. His story did not fit, and yet it did not have the tidy ingenuity of a prepared lie. It had instead the ragged edges of panic. It was Mrs. Hodge who supplied the next small piece of the mosaic. "Mr. Pemberton sent me home early yesterday," she said slowly, frowning as she retraced the steps of her afternoon. 3:30 it was. "He said he had private business to attend to. I passed Mrs. Pemberton on the lane not long after, walking toward the dairy with a parcel under her arm." Mrs. Pemberton turned sharply. "Arthur asked me to bring him some papers he'd left at home. We spoke briefly in the office. He was very much alive at that point, I can assure you." "And what time was that, madam?" Inspector Slack demanded. 5:15. I remember distinctly because the church clock had just chimed the half hour when I left home, and it takes me 15 minutes to walk here." Julian shifted uneasily. "And I arrived around 6, he put in with the air of a man who disliked being left out of the accounting. "We argued about my debts, yes, but he was quite alive when I left him. Shouting, in fact. Yet Haydock tells us he was dead by 7, the vicar said quietly, which leaves at best an hour of unaccounted time." Miss Marple, who had taken a particular interest in the muddy tyre tracks earlier, now chose to speak with seeming irrelevance. "I wonder," she murmured, "how long it takes to drive from here to the old quarry road and back, particularly if one were careful not to be seen." Inspector Slack looked at her with open irritation. What business would anyone have at the quarry? "Oh, people use such places for all sorts of things," Miss Marple replied serenely. "Dumping unwanted items, hiding things they would rather not have found. Long ago, when I was staying with my niece in Much Deeping, there was a most distressing case of puppies abandoned." Slack cut her off with a resigned sigh. "Very well. Polk, take a man and search the quarry track. If our missing van's been abandoned anywhere nearby, I want to know." As the constables departed, Miss Marple watched Mrs. Pemberton and Julian with quiet interest. The widow stood very straight, her face composed but was rigid, as if carved from the marble. Julian's nervousness had acquired a new flavour, not guilt alone, but calculation. He seemed, Miss Marple thought, like a man rapidly reassessing the odds at a gaming table. She tucked this observation away alongside another, seemingly trivial recollection. Mrs. Price's comment that her milk bottle had been left not in its usual holder, but perched oddly on the gatepost. Such details, in isolation, were nothing. Together, they began to acquire shape. "It is all rather like rearranging the furniture in a room," she reflected inwardly. "One can often tell more from what has been moved than from what has been left." Aloud, she only said in her mildest voice, "I do hope, Inspector, that when your men return they will have found exactly what we most need." The old quarry track wound away from the Verviers like a half-forgotten scar, its rutted surface bearing the impressions of many years' worth of quiet, unofficial traffic. Inspector Slack, marching up to the front with the Constable Polk, made a pretense of knowing precisely where he was going, though it was Miss Marple who had pointed out the faint blue flecks of paint caught on a protruding stone at the lane's edge. "Same shade as the dairy van," de Haydock remarked, falling into step beside her. "Our murderer hasn't been as careful as they imagined." Miss Marple merely inclined her head, her pale blue eyes following the broken branches and flattened grass that marked the passage of a vehicle too large for such a narrow track. In her experience, clever criminals often neglected the simplest details. They were so busy thinking about the grand design that they forgot the ordinary ways in which the world left impressions of what had passed. The quarry opened before them as a wide hollow in the landscape, its stone walls streaked with mineral stains and ivy. Once a place of noisy industry, it was now a kislant disused bowl where rainwater had collected in a dark, stagnant pool. Near the far edge, half concealed behind a screen of scrub and gorse, stood Arthur Pemberton's blue delivery van. Inspector Slack hurried forward with an eagerness that betrayed his earlier embarrassment. He wrenched open the rear doors, then stopped short, his satisfaction abruptly giving way to something more complex. Milk crates stacked with meticulous care fill the interior, but instead of empty bottles, the crates held ledgers, correspondence bundles, and loose-cut pages tied with string, a mobile archive of Pemberton's business dealings spanning years. Some bundles bore dates from long ago, others were more recent, marked with red pencil notation in Arthur's firm hand. "Good Lord," murmured the vicar. He was moving his records. "Or hiding them," De Haydock suggested dryly. "From whom, I wonder?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her attention had fixed on a small dark stain on the van's metal floor near the rear edge. Dried now, but still unmistakable. She saw, too, the faint scuff marks along the lip, as though someone's shoes had scraped there while their body was dragged or shifted. "The head wound," she said softly. "Doctored." Haydock mentioned the angle was downward, as if from a fall onto something hard. If Mr. Pemberton had been standing at the edge of the van, arguing with someone inside, a sudden push backward would have sent him down onto that metal lip quite fatally. Inspector Slack crouched to examine the stain, his earlier scepticism visibly eroding. "Killed here, then driven back to the dairy and arranged among the crates," he muttered. "But why bring the body back at all? Why not leave it here?" Miss Marple's answer came with a quiet assurance of someone who had watched human behaviour all her life. Because a man found dead in a secluded quarry suggests private enmity, something personal and deliberate. A man found among his milk crates, however, invites talk of accidents, of slips and unfortunate falls in the course of ordinary work. Or, the vicar added gravely, it invites suspicion towards those already associated with the dairy. Employees, business rivals. Someone wanted to control where blame would naturally fall. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the stacked papers. One particular bundle caught her eye, correspondence between the dairy and several local farmers. Many of the letters bore Arthur Pemberton's impatient marginal notes, but some newer editions, clipped and pinned to older sheets, were in a different, neater hand with a faint scent of lavender still clinging to the paper. "How very curious," she murmured. "It seems certain people have been far more involved in the running of the dairy than they would have us believe." She turned then, quite suddenly, and addressed Inspector Slack with an uncharacteristic firmness. "I think, Inspector, that it is time we return to the village. There are 2 or 3 questions I should very much like to put to Mrs. Pemberton, though I dare say it may be more illuminating to hear what she chooses not to answer." Her tone was mild, but in her eyes there was a sharp knowing light. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning at last, not through fingerprints or clever analyses, but through the oldest evidence of all: fear, pride, and the small telling, contradictions of human nature. News of Mrs. Pemberton's arrest spread through Segnetal. Mary Mead, with the efficiency of a well-run postal service and the relish of a village accustomed to quieter entertainments. By the time Miss Marple returned from the quarry, the green had become a quiet stage upon which her reactions unfolded with predictable variety. Mrs. Price was outraged in a most satisfying manner. "All those years I defended that woman," she declared to anyone within earshot. "Said she was cold, I did, but honest. Shows what we know about people, doesn't it?" Mr. Badger the butcher took a more commercial view. "Ruination for the dairy," he muttered darkly. "People won't trust their milk now, not for months. We'll all be feeling the effects of this, mark my words." At the post office, Miss Hartwell relayed developments with a kind of solemn delight. "Poisoned milk and forged ledgers," she intoned. "Divorce too. I always said there was something odd about the way she folded her letters before sealing them. Over-careful people are nearly always hiding something." Miss Marple listened to these pronouncements with her usual mild attention as she collected her afternoon post. The village, she reflected, would heal over the scandal like grass over a grave, but the shape of things would not be quite the same. Trust once shaken seldom returned unaltered. It was later that afternoon over tea with the vicar and his wife that the threads of the affair were drawn together more tidily. Griselda, looking both shocked and secretly exhilarated, poured out Darjeeling with more drama than was strictly necessary. "To think," she exclaimed, "we have been consuming diluted milk for over a year and never suspected. I feel quite personally affronted." "The moral issue is perhaps more troubling than the physical one," the vicar observed gravely. "Systematic fraud, marital betrayal, calculated cruelty, and all done so very quietly. It makes one rather uneasy about the apparently respectable, does it not, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Respectability, dear vicar, is very often a matter of surface only. It is astonishing what may be concealed beneath a well-polished veneer. In Mrs. Pemberton's case, there was desperation as well as calculation. Years of living within the confines of another person's temper can have a most wearing effect. But the cascara in the milk, Griselda pressed. That seems almost theatrical. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied gently, it was very practical. When one has been adulterating the milk with water for 18 months, one must expect the figures to betray one eventually. A contamination scare supplies a most convenient explanation for irregularities in both accounts and quality. People are far more inclined to accept misfortune than malice. The vicar frowned. And the forged ledgers? That seems a step beyond mere self-protection. Oh, that was purely strategic, Miss Marple said mildly. Julian's gambling debts and his known friction with his uncle made him an ideal scapegoat. Mrs. Pemberton was a woman who understood the usefulness of multiple lines of defence. If her story of an accidental fall failed, there awaited the careful picture of a dissolute nephew driven to desperation. Griselda shuddered delicately. I find it rather chilling the way she confessed at the quarry. So calm, so finished. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, her pale blue eyes distant. But you see, my dear, she had been living with the prospect of exposure for some time. Arthur's decision to divorce her and go to the authorities was, in her mind, a final betrayal after years of shared wrongdoing. When she pushed him, I do not think she fully intended murder. But once it was done, she fell back on habits already formed, the habits of deception and manipulation. She looked down at her knitting, fingers resuming their steady work. That is the difficulty with small dishonesty. One so easily steps from the lesser to the greater. Water in the milk 1 month, forged figures the next, and soon enough one is driving a husband's body back from a quarry and arranging him among the milk crates. The vicar sighed deeply. Human nature, Miss Marple, is a most disquieting study. Yes, she said softly, and yet so very consistent. The following afternoon the vicar and Dr. Haydock called on Miss Marple ostensibly to inquire after her health following all the excitement, though both men were perfectly aware that what they truly wanted was an albeit explanation, calm, orderly, and complete earlier. Miss Marple received them with the tea, seed cake, shakaki, and her usual air of mild distraction. Yet as soon as they settled themselves, the vicar leaned forward with barely concealed eagerness. Miss Marple, he began, cannot help but feel that we all arrived at the truth somewhat abruptly. I should be grateful if you would explain how you knew, or at least suspected, that Mrs. Pemberton was the culprit. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled. Oh, I did not know, dear vicar. One can never be quite certain. But I was very much afraid it might be so. Dr. Haydock gave a dry chuckle. Afraid, were you? You looked remarkably composed while gently dismantling the inspector's case. It was not so very clever, Miss Marple protested, pouring tea with a steady hand. You see, the milk was the first thing. The milk? The vicar repeated. But of course. If Billy had truly fled at 4 and never returned, who delivered the morning milk? Someone familiar enough with the round to do it correctly, and with sufficient composure to add cascara to every bottle. That is not the work of a frightened boy in hiding. Julian might have done it, Dr. Haydock suggested. He knew the business. Possibly, but cascara is an old-fashioned remedy, favoured by those of a wooden generation, Mrs. Pemberton's, for instance. And then there was her reaction, or rather, her lack of it. A woman who hears the manner of her husband's death, the bruises, the head wound. Such details produce some involuntary sign, even in the most reserved natures, yet she remained entirely controlled. Miss Marple took a delicate sip of tea. Then there were the keys. In villages, keys are very revealing. It is, Pemberton had spares cut in secret, yet claimed they were merely for garden sheds. At the same time, the biscuit tin spares vanished, and the medicine cabinet, normally locked, had been opened. Someone with both opportunity and foreknowledge had planned rather than improvised. And the forged ledger, the vicar said thoughtfully. Yes, fresh ink on supposedly old entries. Her needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting. That suggested someone cool-headed enough after the death to sit down and manufacture evidence. That felt feminine to me, if I may say so. A man inclined to violence and quarrel often relies on his temper. A woman in such desperate straits more often relies on arrangement. Harsh but not inaccurate, murmured Dr. Haydock. And of course the glove, Miss Marple continued. Women are forgetful about gloves only when agitated. Mrs. Pemberton's were of a very particular make, and when you, Doctor, mentioned blue paint beneath poor Mr. Pemberton's nails, I could not help thinking of someone struggling to prevent him climbing into or out of that van. The vicar regarded her with a mixture of admiration and faint dismay. You make it sound inevitable. Oh no, Miss Marple said gently. Nothing is inevitable but character. Mrs. Pemberton had lived so long by managing appearances that when everything was threatened, her respectability, her comfort, she chose the one method she understood. Careful arrangement. She tried to arrange her husband's death as she arranged her household accounts. Only her needles paused. Human beings are not figures in a ledger. They leave the most inconvenient traces behind. There was a brief, respectful silence, Seymour. You know, Dr. Haydock said at last, for a quiet village, Saint Ed, Merrymead is a dangerous place to commit murder. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not dangerous, Doctor, simply observational. Outside the milk cart of a neighbouring farm rattled past, the bottles clinking innocently. The ordinary sounds of village life resumed. A dog barking, children's voices on the green, the distant hum of gossip. St. Mary Mead on the surface was perfectly unchanged. Miss Marple's gaze rested thoughtfully on the lane. People, she said softly, half to herself, are really much the same everywhere. Only the bad circumstances differ. One learns to recognise the pattern. Her knitting needles moved again with quiet certainty, as if following a design only she could fully see.